All right, ladies and gentlemen, guess who is back? We are here. And we're going to do this. I'm showing up late to this party, as always, late and fashionable, I'd like to think. I know 1,000 people have done reactions to this on all ends of the spectrum. There has been Christians, there's been atheists, agnostics, extreme fundamentalist Christians, in between Christians, progressive Christians. Everybody's gotten a crack at this. I mean, Gavin Ortlund, Randall Rouser, I know, made reactions to this. Trent Horn made a reaction to this. Several atheists have made reactions to this. I can't remember any off the top of my head, but I know I've seen some of them. So everybody has wanted to get in on this one, and I can understand why. This is one of my favorite Christian apologists of all time. That is William Lane Craig. His work has been super helpful for me. I'd say that my testimony is probably not the only one. I'm sure a lot of the people who are subscribed to this channel probably have the same testimony. Just a great defender of the faith. But he's now going to be defending probably, if not, at least in the top 3 of the toughest things to defend in the Bible. The slaughter of the Canaanites. And I want to just kind of put this out here right now for everyone who comes, because I understand, I want to be sensitive to the fact that there are probably going to be atheists, agnostics who click on this video. This is a tough one for me and for a lot of Christians. And I want to be sensitive to I understand where concerns come up in this. This is something that Christians have debated. There's several views on this. Everybody's kind of trying to figure out where they come down on it. So if you are kind of coming from a position of non-belief, I just ask, be patient, be patient and sensitive to the topic here, because there is a lot of nuance to this. And, you know, the objections you're going to raise, a thoughtful Christian will know those objections, and they'll be grappling with them as well. So I do want to encourage you, please put your thoughts in the comment section. And same for Christians, but this is kind of an in-house discussion among Christians as we kind of decide, not decide, but like kind of figure out how all this fits together. And there's a lot of ways to go with that. And I get that this is a strong point of external critique of the Bible and God and the personhood of God. However, I would say this, that, you know, most Christians I know of defend morality from a divine command to some degree. God, well, not divine command. It's not the command of God, but the nature of God, right? It's not that God commands something and that becomes moral because he commanded it, or it's moral so he commands it. It's that it lines up with the nature of God as well. And in absence of God, we have a problem with morality, and that is, where's it come from, right? And if God doesn't exist, I would put this, like, this is a problem for non-believers. If God doesn't exist, is there really anything objectively wrong about what happened to the Canaanites, right? Or the Amalekites, or anyone, by the way? Like, why would it be wrong one way or another? It would just kind of be, you know, inconvenient. But I also understand that if you affirm that God exists, God is love, and you find something that doesn't comport with that, and you can't reconcile it, that is a serious critique and objection. So, and Christians as well. Let's be sensitive to this. This is just a tough thing to do. William Lane Craig, I have massive respect for him. Biases on the table. Let's throw our biases on the table, because everyone has them, and let's not act like we don't. I'm a Christian. I also don't necessarily hold to divine command theory. I don't know where I am. I don't come down where Randall Rouser does. I'd be in between, probably. Something in between Paul Copen and Jimmy Akin's position on this. But I'd like us all to just hear out the positions and see where we land. And hopefully we get good debate in the comments section. Please be nice about it. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. You know, I like doing this, and we all have a lot of fun over here, so you don't want to miss out on it. And again, be respectful in the comment section. If you are a massive, colossal jerk, you're getting kicked. So just there's other places for you. But if you're respectful and want to engage in a dialogue, we would love to have you, and I'll try to respond to whatever I can if you have a question. And let me know what you'd like to see next on this channel. But let's go William Lane Craig and Alex O'Connor.
Now, I didn't invite you on the show to spend an hour agreeing with you, so I think now is a good time to move on to the actual criticisms that Dawkins has made, specifically in regards to why he refuses to debate you. As I've said before, a lot of people want to see this debate, and I know that you've offered him the opportunity a number of times, and he's turned it down. And he claims that the reason that he does this, whether this be the real reason or not, the reason he gives is that William Lane Craig is an immoral person because he is an apologist for genocide, pointing specifically in his original article and original objection to the issue of the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, which you've defended as a morally defensible thing for God to have commanded and for the Israelites to have enacted. So what I really want to do now is jump into this story. I want to talk about the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, what happened, why it's problematic, and what your moral defense is of that story. So perhaps we can begin by talking about who were the Canaanites.
All right. Prior to Israel's liberation from bondage in Egypt, the land of Canaan, or modern-day Israel, was populated by small clans of Canaanite inhabitants. And according to the biblical narrative, these clans of Canaanites were extremely evil. They were debauched morally, and opposed God. And God let this go on for 400 years while Israel was in Egypt. But then he called Israel out of Egypt and led them to the land of Canaan and delivered the land over to Israel and said, drive out the Canaanites from the land on pain of death. And I am giving this land to you, to Israel. So they were the pre-Israeli inhabitants of this region of the world on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea.
And as you say, the Old Testament makes it clear that God considered these people to be an immoral people, much in the same way that before the flood of Noah, we sort of have this pleading with God of saying, look, are there not any good people amongst this community? Are you really going to flood the entire world? Is there not one person worth saving? And as far as I know, most people defend God's action here by saying that the answer is no, that the society had become so corrupt that there wasn't any sort of salvageable morality. And I suppose something like that is going on with the Canaanites here. I suppose,
if I might comment, this is not
well, and one thing I will point out about this, when we're discussing the Canaanites, there's been kind of a strange move. I wouldn't call it a scholarship. I don't want to be mean and say pseudo scholarship, but I'd say more armchair scholarship to paint kind of this conflict as kind of the Canaanites as sort of these lovey-dovey nice people that, never did anything wrong, and they were just one day, walking around, and then these mean, brutal forces came in and slaughtered them all, kind of like, Saruman and the hobbits. But regardless of how you come down on the morality of it, I think it is good context, because we do need to look at the nuances on both sides. So let's not use unequal weights and balances and say, well, the Canaanites were super duper evil, and God, and the Israelites can go kill whoever they want, right? Man, woman, and child, because they were evil. I think that's a flawed way of looking at it, but it's also a flawed way of looking at it to say, the Canaanites, a couple of them were bad apples, and, and then they got killed. It is worth noting, yes, the Canaanite society from historical records is not a very good society. I mean, practicing of bestiality taking place. I mean, there's a temple worship like that, but what's really problematic is child sacrifice, which was very prevalent all throughout the ancient world, but the Canaanites also are taking part in that. And, Randall Rouser has a argument, well, you can't just cherry pick and say these sources represent all of Canaanite society, and that's fair. He's like, there's plenty of terrible things in American culture, but if you picked that out 100 years from now and said all Americans were like this, that would be flawed. That is true, and I think that we need to embrace that as true. However, the argument that not everyone sacrificed their children doesn't necessarily meet the burden of, was it approved in society, right? You may not have sacrificed your child, but you probably didn't think it was a bad thing. Same with, let's look at antebellum slavery. I mean, did everyone own slaves in the South? Absolutely not. I mean, most of them didn't. They just didn't have the money for it. But did they oppose the institution? No. I mean, most of them saw that as a legitimate institution, and they wanted to partake in the slave trade. They just didn't have the money for it. So, yes, there can be way more things going on at the same time, and if you went back in time to the Canaanite society, the chances of you finding, 80% of them, like, yes, we oppose child sacrifice and bestiality, but these 20% bad apples over here are doing it and we can't stop them. If I had to put money on it, if we were wagering, not saying one thing or another on the morality of it, but I would say the inverse of that, right? If that, probably you're looking at 80-90% of this people group, and probably more than that are in favor of all this stuff and are living very immorally. Now, does that in and of itself justify the conquest of Canaan? That's the question. We need to put that on the table. So I'm not making the argument just because of that. This also follows. But what I am saying is we do need to properly put on the right lenses for what we're looking at, right? This is not the same as you walking into a hospital and killing 100 infants, right? Now, that being said, if infants were targeted, which it seems like the Bible says they were, especially with the Canaanites and the Amalekites, there needs to be a defense given of that. And I'm the first to say that is a problem. That's problematic, and we need to figure out why that's the case, if that's the case, right? Or it could be a mirrorism. That is a possible alternative, and Paul Copan and Gavin Ortland go in that position, and I probably would fall down there, that it's just a mirrorism. It's not actually talking about actually killing infants, but what it is saying is it's giving a totality of the destruction, of the scale of the destruction, and I think there's a lot of play in the joints on that. But I do think it's helpful context to know what we're discussing and to have full context for what the people group is on both sides, Israel and Canaan, and what we're actually dealing with.
Simply biblically attested. I have a colleague, Professor Clay Jones, who has done a study of ancient literature coming out of pre-Israelite Canaan. And it is horrific, the culture that is described there. This was one that practiced not only all sorts of human sexual aberrations, but also temple prostitution in the worship of God. They practiced bestiality. There are texts describing how a buck would be strapped down to a wooden frame.
Okay, yeah, I don't think we need... I'm going to skip over here. Just know in that I like to keep, not that we're monetized yet, but I don't like our videos getting banned. So we don't need the full graphic details on what the Canaanite people did. Just know it was not good stuff. I mean, it wasn't good stuff. All right. Can we just leave it at it wasn't good stuff and move on to the other part of the dialogue? But yeah, again, I'm sorry if you want to hear the full context, go watch the actual video. I'm just trying to guard the algorithms from banning our videos.
I suppose I intuitively find it difficult to believe that there's not a single person in this community who is not so like unsalvageably touched or consumed by sin in this way, that the actions we see the Israelites committing on the command of God can be justified. So to give people an idea, to give them the full picture, we've described who the Canaanites are, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about that. But the reason that this is a problem, the reason why Richard Dawkins is talking about these people, is because, as you say, God promises this land to the Israelites, and he waits 400 years and says this is because the sin sort of hasn't got bad enough yet, essentially. He says it will happen in 400 years because by that point things will be so bad that this will be sort of justifiably inflicted. But he commands the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites. And the language used in the Bible is quite extreme in a few different areas, talking about completely destroying a city, leaving nothing alive that breathes. And on the point about innocent people, because I know you'll have something to say about that, but we know that there are at least some innocent people among the Canaanites, because in the 6th chapter of Joshua, in the destruction of Jericho,
Yes.
it said that they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, maybe the men and women were immoral. I certainly don't think that children living among the Canaanites were immoral enough to justify their being killed, and certainly not the
Right.
cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys.
Right. The difficult, I think, aspect of this is the children. The adults were corrupt. If there was an innocent person among the adults, that person didn't have to be killed. It's important to understand that God's command to Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to drive the Canaanites out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated. So people didn't have to die. They weren't pursued and chased down until everyone was exterminated. These clans were driven out of the land. They were be destroyed as nation states, but not as individual people. And it's important to understand that for these ancient Near Eastern people, as for modern Near Eastern people, it is the land that is so important. It is all about the land. Even today, when you go to Israel, people will talk about coming to the land. That's how they refer to it. So what God was doing was giving the land of Canaan from or to Israel and divesting these Canaanite clans of the possession of the land of Canaan. And so they were driven out, and not all of them were killed. Later in the narratives in the Pentateuch, you find Canaanites still about.
Yeah.
So they weren't all killed.
If I may, on
So
this point,
one thing to also take into account here that he's bringing up there is that God makes a way out. Now, you may say that that doesn't justify anything, and again, let's be sensitive to it, but God is making a way out. And that is true, according to the biblical narrative, those who leave wouldn't be pursued or chased down. But I will give a caveat here, because here's something that should be brought up, and that is, I think it's in Joshua 5, in the destruction of Ai, the city of Ai, right? They attack, they go out and chase the army that's retreating, and then they go back into the city of Ai, and they kill everybody there, right? The people who weren't fighting, specifically. So that's something that needs to be dealt with. I mean, that's something that needs to be looked at. This is going to be a problem from the divine command theory, which is what William Lane Craig is representing here, because the divine command theory says it's everything basically in the narrative happens as it is proclaimed, right? There's no kind of metaphorical work here. There's not a lot of rhetoric being used. Now, some divine command theorists would also hold to the idea that there's some rhetoric being used because it's a scale. We're on a kind of a spectrum. But they'll say, even if it was exactly literally like it said, it can be that way because God has the right to take away life. There is an argument for that, guys. Again, before we rush to judgment, I saw the comment section of this video was just spilling over with vitriol and venom and hatred. And I get this is a sensitive topic, but please open your eyes. There is an argument for that, right? Do a little research on it. You may come down and hate it and not like it, but William Lane Craig is not a genocide apologist, all right? Divine command theorists are not supporting some sort of genocidal idea. There's a lot of nuances to it. However, you can escape this. You can escape it if this caricature, or you can escape this problem by taking more of the Jimmy Akin position, which is this is all written after the fact. It's, it's divinely inspired scripture, but this is written during the Babylonian exile when they've sinned against God and they've worshipped idols and they've, been intertwined with Canaanite gods. And by the way, indeed, the text in the narrative is very clear on that. Drive the Canaanites out because I don't want you worshiping and following other gods. I don't want you sacrificing your children, to me or to any other gods. I don't want you involved in their religious systems, right? So after the fact, when Israel fell into these religious systems and were cast out of the land in a Babylonian exile, this is written not kind of as a warning or as to, to put in your mind the problems that you guys had. And that was you worshiping and going after other gods. And Joshua is written then explaining those historical narratives, but the people are so distantly removed from the historical narratives, there's more play in the joints for what they're talking about. So when they talk about, destroy man, woman, and children, all these things, they're not actually referring really to something that actually happened. They're referring to what should have happened, or the idea of what should have happened. We should have removed this ideology. We should have removed these false gods. We should have removed them out of the land, and then we wouldn't have been cast into Babylonian exile. Now, you may not like that theory, and you may say that that doesn't comport properly, but that is a way of understanding the text. It is, and it escapes the criticism. But again, there is an argument to be made for divine command theory. There's an argument to be made in the middle of what I just gave as a theory. And then there's the argument to the other side of that Randall Rouser would propose, that there's just a kind of not errors in the text, but not like we would traditionally think of errors in the text. So again, but let's be humble about it and understand that this is a hard passage to grapple with.
That we've got to so far. Firstly, this idea that, well, not everybody's killed because they're given the opportunity to leave their land. They're given the opportunity to be driven out. It's only if they stay and resist that they get killed. And the way you just cash that out is by saying, so they had a decision and didn't have to die. It seems to me that, of course, you're going to understand this as something that God has commanded. So whatever the reason may be, it must be the morally right thing to do. However, from my perspective, what I'm seeing here is a foreign nation approaching the native inhabitants of land which they believe is their own, saying, you need to leave. And when they refuse, killing them and then saying, well, look, I gave you a choice, didn't I? Because you could have just left. I mean, that in other words, doesn't seem like much of a defense to me.
Right. We were talking about whether or not the Canaanites were corrupt and whether or not this was an act of divine judgment upon them. But I've not explicated here the moral theory that undergirds my defense of this action. It is very possible that had this been undertaken by human initiative alone, that it would have been immoral, as the way you described. But the ethical theory that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. According to this theory, moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority. So, for example, if I were driving and some random person told me to pull over, I wouldn't have any obligation to obey that person at all. But if a policeman commanded me to pull over, then in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to pull over and obey what he's done.
Right.
And
but
so
one thing I would like to point out is undergirding morality to it, or order of systems here. So if you ran a red light and a stranger, passerby, tells you to pull over, you don't have to pull over, right? He doesn't have the authority to demand that. If you run a red light and the policeman tells you to pull over, you need to pull over. However, that doesn't change the fact it was immoral to run the red light, regardless. Whether the person has the authority to get to sideline you on the road, the action of what you did is still improper and incorrect and wrong. And by the way, this is where a lot of people will caricature divine command theory, and I think you do need to read it properly, but I can understand there can be a caricature of this theory. And again, I don't hold this theory, but a caricature could come in, and that is, well, divine command theory is whatever God wants to be right is right, right? He can pick and choose. He can say one day this is moral, it's immoral to kill your children, you can't sacrifice them, and then the next day you can kill whoever you want because, his mood is changing depending on what day he wakes up on that side of the bed. And I think that's wrong. I think that's a caricature of the position, but I can understand how people can get there. And I think what's underlying that is moral, right? If God is morality, then God can't just change. He can't just flip on a dime what's moral and what's not. Now, that gets us into broader questions, and this is something we all need to grapple with, of what is moral, right? I mean, let's be honest, this whole universe was created by God. We are all created by God. We're sustained by God. We already agree that God can give and take life whenever he wants to. We don't consider it immoral when someone dies of a disease or someone just randomly dies. Well, that's God taking life. I mean, he gave it and he took it away at an accepted time. So we all agree with that. We agree that if we agree the world is his and he created it, then we would agree that we're just stewards of the land. Whatever we're given is not really ours as much as it is God. So if God wants to take the land away from us, he's free to take it away from us, right? And if he wants to take us out of the world, he's free to do that too. The problem comes into the mechanism of what he does, the mechanisms, and are those mechanisms proper? Can he properly instruct someone to go kill someone, right, and take their land? That's going to be where the conflict comes in. But I do want to defend divine command theorists on a broader level, where they're coming from at least, and kind of macro, not micro? Yeah, go to a macro level and look at it all as a narrative and picture and go back to some of the principles that they're articulating. Because in the details, this can just seem like a willy-nilly, I can throw things at the wall and get what I want. But I do think there's a underlying method to what's being articulated here.
Theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably, God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And therefore, on this theory, God has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's impossible that God could do something wrong, because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself to obey.
So how does that
constraint?
How does that skirt around the Euthyphro dilemma? Because the way that it's normally been associated is the Euthyphro dilemma, if you're not catching up on what that is basically is the good because the gods declare it to be good, or do the gods declare it to be good because it's good, right? And the dilemma that's presented is, if good is good because, and this was articulated back in ancient Greece, so that's why gods is used, not God. If good is good because the gods declare it to be good, well, then it's no more good. It's not really good, is it? It's just, if the gods declared, I don't know, murder to be good, that would be what's good, right? But if they declare acts of charity to be good, that's good. But neither one, there's no real moral distinction between the two. It just depends on how they want to declare what's good. But if it predates the gods, right? If they call it good because it's good before them, then there's something that the gods must be subservient to that exists outside of them, right? That they didn't create. Would be the argument against kind of the gods' involvement in good. But the way to skirt that, and William Lane Craig has said this in his not debate but dialogue with Jordan Peterson and Michelle Goldberg. I think Michelle Goldberg, who is the wife of Steven Pinker. I think it may. If I'm wrong, if it's not Michelle Goldberg, forgive me. But go look up the dialogue. That the way to avoid this criticism is to say, the good is good because it is the essence of the gods, right? They aren't competing with one another. They are merged together. But in the way that he just articulated it, wouldn't there be some kind of problem with that view of it? Because it seems like the good is good because it's commanded by God. And since there's no commands that are on God, God can command what he wants to be good. I think that you may fall down on the wrong end of the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. We'd have to study a little bit deeper into that, but I can understand how that may be an issue that rises up. Let's do a little more of this. I don't. Let me go over to. Is there? Where do they talk about the infants? Because I think that is. I think that probably would be the best place to go. Here, this is probably be a good place to. We're probably going to end off with this, guys. An ad.
Run
Yay!
Windows on Mac and open a world with no limits.
That's what happens on YouTube, guys. All right, here we go.
Hawkins quotes an article that you wrote in response to this issue, and I suppose I should read what the point that he pulled out, which summarizes this position here. You said, "So whom does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites?
Right.
Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. Not the children, for they inherit eternal life. So who is wronged? Ironically, I think the most difficult part of this whole debate is the apparent wrong done to the Israeli soldiers themselves.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what it would be like to have to break into some house and kill a terrified woman and her children? The brutalizing effect on these Israeli soldiers is disturbing. I must say that the disturbing thing to me there is I can't shake this feeling. And like I say, I have respect for you as a thinker and a philosopher, and I always enjoy our conversations. But hearing somebody talking about the slaughter of admittedly and explicitly innocent children, not to mention animals, as well as the eradication, driving out of an entire society, and to say that, well, the people who really suffered here were the soldiers who had to kill the innocent woman. It just, in a way that like I said at the very beginning of this segment, there's nothing I can do strictly speaking to prove that there's no justification for this. But if there is anything that I've ever heard in my life that jumps out of a page with pure moral repugnance in the way that it meets my ears, it has to be something like that.
Well, I've really thought hard and dispassionately about this, Alex, and I tried to think as hard as I could, who has been wronged in this action? And it's very difficult to think of anyone who has been wronged by God in commanding this. And then it hit me, well, what about the Israeli soldiers themselves? Because we do know from soldiers who suffer from PTSD that the brutalizing effects of war upon soldiers is terrible and can be destructive. And so I explore at some length, what about the wrong done to these soldiers who had to carry out this command? Is there any motivation that might justify giving such a command to them? In the original article, I suggest that yes, indeed, there are goods that would be achieved by having them carry out this command, and that God would have morally sufficient reasons for doing that. That's in my original question of the week, number 16, if people are interested in following it up, where I argue that, in fact, even the soldiers themselves would not be wronged by God issuing such a command. But I was looking for anybody that God had wronged. And, the atheist philosopher, British philosopher Daniel Came, responding to this sort of tiff between Dawkins and me, he said, I think that even though I'm not a Christian, he said Craig's position is entirely reasonable, that the children are not wronged in inheriting eternal life. We're all going to die. Someday many children do die, and God's taking the life of these children prematurely doesn't commit a wrong against them. It's actually, they're good. Now, don't let anybody say, oh, well, then we ought to go kill children. No, that would transgress a divine command against homicide And therefore, in the absence of a divine command, that would be morally wrong. It is only given this divine command from the paradigm of goodness itself that one would be morally obligated to carry out such a horrific action.
But look,
All right,
one of the things that
and I think we'll probably leave it there, but I can see the case being made, and because we skipped over a little bit of what to do with infants, but the case that Dr. Craig makes is that, well, the infants are growing up in a terrible society of just sin and reprobation, that they're growing up in that society, they would follow in the footsteps of their parents and in their ancestors and become reprehensible people that would be against God. And because of that, God, as a blessing to them, has them removed. And I can see that argument, but here's the problem that's going to come up, and that is, why by a sword? Really? Like, why by, and Randall Rouser gives a good example of this, like, why in close proximity do men in uniforms have to come in with a sword and run little children through? Like, that's what would have happened, like, and take spears and run them through, little infants. Why not just give them some sort of disease, have them all die? Why not just shut off their breathing? Why not just take them home, give them a heart attack or something? Like, God would have multiple ways of doing this, so why that? And again, I get it. I understand that. And I can also understand, I don't think this charge is legitimate towards Dr. Craig, but Dr. Craig is a philosopher and he's thinking philosophically. The problem is, in this argument, and I get where Alex O'Connor is coming from, this is an emotionally charged argument that's full of emotions and emotional intuition, right? And if you don't address it with the proper emotional balance, people are going to think that you're cynical or that you just don't see it or you don't care. And whether you can point out whether God wronged anyone or not, in order to help someone through this and get them to your perspective, you've got to let them know that you understand the terrible struggle that you have here. You have to let them understand that, like, yeah, oh man, I know where you're coming from. Man, this is the hardest thing for me to do. It was so hard when I was studying it, but I think legitimately that if you study a divine command theory properly, it makes sense of this. But it was agonizing to go through the process of figuring this out. I think that you need to be honest about that with people, because if you're not, it's going to lead to people, mainly in the comment section of the video, that are just like, you just don't care, right? You think that God can do whatever he wants and he can kill infants, for whenever he feels like it. And with how is that comporting with a loving God, right? How does that comport with our own conscience and our own moral intuitions? Again, I don't think Dr. Craig is trying to come across that way, but I do think this is just a word of advice to anyone, Christian or non, when we're dealing with really serious issues that our side presents, and that is, if someone's coming to you and you're like, they're saying what Alex O'Connor says, I just can't get my head around this. If anything's immoral, this is immoral. If you have felt that way too, at a certain time before you studied it, let them know that. Let them know, yeah, I get where you're coming from. I felt the same way. I still struggle with it today. But here's what I think makes sense of the argument. Now, there's many different ways to take this, and I'd recommend everybody go out and research the topic and figure out where you can comfortably come down, where the logic makes sense, where the facts are not cherry-picked, and where you think it comports with morality and the love of God. I think all of those need to be taken into account. But this was a fairly good conversation. Now, that being said, Richard Dawkins doesn't really have a defense, not to debate William Lane Craig. I think that he made this one up because he's been making a series of reasons why he can't debate him for like 15 years, probably because he got spanked in the Lennox debate. Be honest, Dawkins is not necessarily, if you're an atheist, Dawkins, I think most of you agree, Dawkins is not necessarily your best defender. I think Graham Oppie is a way better defender of it. We're going to do something with Graham coming up in the future, a reaction to one of his things. There are some really good atheist thinkers. I just don't think Dawkins is one of them. But that being said, It's a tough situation to deal with, and I think we all need to have grace and humility when we're dealing with it. But yes, please like and subscribe. Comment your perspective on this video. Let me know what you want me to do next, and I'll see you in the next video.